Hello, everyone. It's a great pleasure to welcome you all to the fourth event of Climate Change and Law Seminar Series organized by the Climate Change and Law Laboratory of KHAS University School of Law. Today, we are particularly delighted to host Professor Dr. Rafael Leal-Arcas'ı, who is a well-known professor combining his knowledge and expertise on investment law with climate change. Before starting, I would like to introduce him to our audience. Professor Leal-Arcas'ı is a Jean Monnet Chaired Professor of European and International Economic Law at the Queen Mary University of London. He is a program director of the LLM in International Economic Law and former director of research at the Center for Commercial Law Studies of Queen Mary University. He completed his graduate legal education with a PhD and 4 master's degrees, a Master of Science Law from Stanford Law School, an LLM from Columbia Law School, a Master of Philosophy from the London School of Economics and Political Science, and a PhD as well as a Master of Arts in Legal Research from the European University Institute. He complemented his education further with executive programs at Harvard Kennedy School of Government, Yale University, and the University of Oxford. Professor Leal-Arcas'ı teaches and is the convener of the courses International Economic Law, WTO Law, Climate Change Law and Policy, Trade, Climate Change and Energy Law, Trade Law, International Trade and Investment Law of the European Union, as well as the External Relations Law of the European Union. He supervises LLM and PhD dissertations in his field of expertise. He successfully won several research grants, most notably a grant of 17 million as part of a consortium of 21 institutions for the Vice Grid project to work on renewable energy and smart grids, funded by the European Union's Horizon 2020 program on research and innovation, where he serves as a principal investigator. He has authored more than 200 scholarly publications on international trade and WTO law, climate change law, European Union law, international investment law, international energy law, and governance. He has very recently published a book titled Climate Clubs for a Sustainable Future, the Role of International Trade and Investment Law. This book explains how creation of climate clubs by bringing the countries together may serve to climate change mitigation. It suggests that by building climate clubs and making use of the international trading and investment systems, it can be reached a better future for all. And I am very excited to hear the climate clubs as a solution to climate crisis from Professor Leal-Arcas'ı. The floor is yours now, Professor Leal-Arcas'ı.
Thank you very much for a very, very generous introduction. I want to thank also the Dean and the organizers of this seminar, which I think is actually very, very timely. In fact, I participated earlier this week, Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday, in a conference that took place. It was supposed to take place in Hamburg, but because of COVID, we had to do it online as we're doing right now, this other seminar. And the conference was part of Germany's presidency of the G7, which, as we all know, is this year, 2022. 2022 is the year when Germany has the presidency of the G7. And the topic that was most discussed was actually climate clubs. So that in itself shows how timely the topic is. And just to show you, this is the book that was being discussed. I don't know whether you can see it well, but the title is Climate Clubs for a Sustainable Future, the Role of International Trade and Investment Law. So what I think I would like to do now here is give the big picture of how the international trading system can actually help mitigate climate change and enhance energy. Right? So I'm trying to put together climate change and energy in the broader context of international trade and see to what extent climate clubs can be part of the solution to the climate crisis that we have. And I'll start with energy security, which is to some degree part also of the climate issue. And to contextualize the situation, let me give you two facts. The first is that more than 1 billion people today have no access to electricity. So that means that 1 in 5 people in the world today has no access to electricity. And more than 95% of these people are in two very distinct areas of the world, Sub-Saharan Africa and developing Asia. The second fact I want to give you to contextualize the importance of energy security is that the whole of Sub-Saharan Africa, without South Africa, uses less electricity than the state of New York. In other words, 1 billion people have less access to electricity than 20 million people. And this obviously raises questions about how you can maximize your potential as a human, right, as a person. That raises the question whether energy is globally well governed today. And of course, it depends on whose point of view. For some people, yes, certainly countries in the West, but for many other countries, that is not the case. And that what we see in the world today is that there are large inequalities in per capita energy consumption across countries. And that raises the question whether the evolving energy trade governance system addresses the inequalities that we see in different parts of the world. Now, bringing together the international trading system, what I want to propose here is a paradigm shift in that we should transform the way we understand international trade. Trade has been responsible for much environmental harm, and there is clear empirical evidence to demonstrate this. In other words, if you have more trade, then you have more energy consumption and therefore more pollution. And now everyone assumes that trade damages the environment, but it doesn't have to be that way. And what I want to propose here in the coming hour is that the trading system is a very powerful instrument for environmental protection, specifically climate change. Now, why my idea of using the international trading system to promote sustainability? One is that every country in the world trades, and that's a fact. Every single country has at least one trade agreement with another country of the world. Second, trade is a wealth generator. And to give you facts here, in 2015, trade made up around 60% of global GDP, according to the World Bank. The past 50 years have seen a 30-fold increase in international trade, and we see that this trend is actually on the rise even during COVID, okay? So trade liberalization means more trade. If you have more trade, you have more economic growth, and economic growth, as we know, means that every country is better off. Hence the importance of international trade. And what we see also empirically is that over the years, since the 1850s, for example, the level of exports has only gone up and up. And that demonstrates, again, empirically, that trade is something that every country is doing. And certainly since the GATT was created in 1947, we see that the number of merchandise exports has only gone up and up. But we also see that there are increasingly countries that are decreasing their tariff rates when it comes to international trade. So in the case of India, in the last 20 years or so, has decreased the level of tariff rate by 50%, China by 30%, and the average of the world by about 5%. The exception to the rule being the case of the United States, which is increasingly becoming protectionist. So in the coming minutes, what I want is first give you my thesis here, which is that the trading system is a very powerful instrument for change. Then I want to talk to you about what I think is insufficient cooperation between international trade and climate change. My third point will be about the possible solutions. Then my fourth point is a textual analysis of 14 free trade agreements that I have analyzed that deal with climate change related issues. And then I will conclude as well as give you some views for my way forward. So let me start with my thesis, and that is that the international trading system is a very powerful instrument for change. And let me give you examples to prove my point here. The first is poverty reduction. Thanks to the international trading system, about 1.2 billion people have come out of poverty between 1990 and 2010, according to the World Bank. So that's a great example where trade has been a powerful instrument for change. Another one is the protection of human rights, where today around 70 to 75% of countries use international trade agreements in order to protect labor rights as an example of human rights. Another example is that of peace. If you think of the European Union, it was actually started for one purpose, to have peace in Europe. So then my question here to all of you, why not use the trading system as a novel tool for what I think is the biggest challenge that humanity faces today, which is climate change mitigation? And again, to contextualize the situation, today about 85% of global energy supply comes from fossil fuels, and energy is around 75% of global greenhouse gas emissions. Now we know that fossil fuels have a few problems. One is that they produce carbon dioxide and therefore contribute to climate change, but also they are finite and not evenly distributed, and therefore there is an issue of energy insecurity. So what we need to do, and this is what all countries and companies are doing right now, is what we call the energy transition, right? Moving away from fossil fuels into renewable energy because it is cleaner than fossil fuels and therefore protects the environment, but also, excuse me, because it helps towards energy independence and therefore enhances energy security. And that raises a very interesting question. Could trade agreements be a solution to decarbonization, which, as I was saying before, is the greatest challenge that humanity faces today? And there are two ways to answer this question. One is through international environmental agreements. Excuse me. But the way I see environmental agreements is that they have not produced strong results in recent times, and enforcement is an issue. In other words, they have no teeth, if you will. So another way to look about this is through trade agreements, because they are enforceable, but also increasingly include chapters that deal with sustainable development. And that raises a very interesting question, which is, are trade agreements more effective than climate change agreements in order to mitigate climate change? And this is a counterintuitive issue here. Who would have thought that a trade agreement could potentially be a more effective legal instrument than climate change agreements for climate change mitigation, if anything, because they are enforceable? And so here my point is that we stand to achieve considerable gains when the trading system becomes a tool for change. And I give you examples where that has been the case. And so the argument here is that the trading system can be a tool to help mitigate climate change and enhance energy security. Think, for example, of the reduction of technical barriers to trade in green goods and services, right? Think of electric vehicles. If now we decide to give preferential treatment to electric vehicles as opposed to combustion energy vehicles, that would be a very simple way to help mitigate climate change through the international trading system. And from here, I have developed a theory that I call the triple benefit of trade. And by that, I mean that through the trading system, we can actually help mitigate climate change, enhance energy security, and continue to grow microeconomically, hence what I call the triple benefit of trade. So that brings me to my second point, which is from insufficient cooperation to effective synergies between trade and climate change. And to understand what I'm trying to say here, I want to go back to 1992, which is when the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change was created. So that was the legal instrument, the first legal instrument that says we recognize that climate change is a serious threat to humanity and we need to do something about it. But then 2 years later, we have another multilateral agreement. This time is the WTO agreement in 1994. And the only thing it says, and by the way, in the preamble, is that sustainable development is important in the context of trade. And I argue this is the first missed opportunity for the trading system to better cooperate with the climate system. If you fast forward a few more years, around 2008, we have what we call the 21st century trade agreements that have weak chapters that deal with sustainable development. So again, this is in my view, a second missed opportunity for the trading system to better cooperate with the climate regime. Fast forward a few more years, and then we have in 2015, the famous Paris Agreement. And surprisingly, it doesn't even mention the term trade. So again, another missed opportunity this time around for the climate regime to better cooperate with the trade system. But my vision is that moving forward, we can actually use the international trading system not only for 2 of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, namely number 7 that deals with energy access and number 13 that deals with climate action, but I would argue with the remaining 15 Sustainable Development Goals. So we can think of the international trading system as a powerful vehicle to make sure that all of us can achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. And there are all kinds of relationships between the private sector and international trade and climate policy on the other. So just to give you an example of what I have in mind here, there is international climate cooperation, where we have, since the Paris Agreement, the so-called nationally determined contributions at the domestic level. Then you have trade policy, where it is an intergovernmental trade cooperation, so government to government. And in the middle between these two, you have all kinds of companies, corporations, the private sector that sits at this intersection of trade and climate change, where a lot of companies have clearly announced that they want to go to net zero commitments. So it's not just countries, but also corporations that are dealing with this idea. And as a result, there are all kinds of opportunities to mobilize trade policy in order to advance climate action. And I'll give you an example of what I have in mind. An example of climate action would be to reduce the cost of technologies for decarbonization. And the trade policies tools that can take us there could be, for example, if we were to cut tariffs on climate-friendly goods and remove unnecessary non-tariff barriers. So this is an example where trade policy can go hand in hand with climate action objectives. Equally, I would argue that there are all kinds of opportunities for businesses to prepare for and support climate trade initiatives. Again, to make it more concrete, I'll give you an example. For instance, think of increasing the understanding of supply chain emissions. That would be a climate trade priority. And the key action would be working with suppliers and customers in order to improve measures of supply chain emissions. That brings me to my third point, which is what are the possible solutions moving forward? And one can think of the multilateral trading multilaterally is a way forward, but it seems to me that it's in decline. If you see the crisis that is currently in the context of the WTO, with the fact that the appellate body is non-functional, think of energy, where we don't have global energy governance. It's very much fragmented. When it comes to the investment regime, the same is true. We don't have a multilateral investment agreement. What we have is very many thousands and thousands of bilateral investment treaties. Another possible solution, therefore, would be plurilateralism, which is something to be explored. And here's where the idea of climate clubs comes into the picture. This is, think of a way to bring together different countries, a number of countries, 5, 10, 20, whatever number of countries you have in mind, and then create a club where they could help each other through, for example, the promotion of technology transfer in order to mitigate climate change. Another possible solution is regionalism, which is on the rise. We see, certainly in the context of international trade, that regional trade agreements have recently been on the rise. One more possible solution is bilateralism. And here what will be crucial in the context of climate change is what I call the G2, the US-China relationship. These are by far the 2 largest emitters of greenhouse gases. China is responsible for 27% of global emissions. The United States is responsible for 13% of global greenhouse gas emissions. If these 2 countries could actually cooperate with each other, that would be also a very effective way to help mitigate climate change. Unilateralism is another option, which is something Europeans have tried, I have to say, rather unsuccessfully. For example, you can think of sector-specific approaches to climate mitigation. And here what Europeans tried was the inclusion of aviation in the emissions trading system. That didn't happen multilaterally because every country in the world and every airline was against this idea, but at least Europeans were able to have aviation, or the inclusion of aviation in the emissions trading system for intra-EU aviation. But nevertheless, Europeans were able, as a result, to create what we have now called a climate agreement on international aviation. And then beyond these horizontal intergovernmental approaches, I think we could have also vertical approaches as part of the solution. And here, what I have in mind is cities in different countries could work together so that the mayor of Sao Paulo could be working with the mayor of Manila in the Philippines, because maybe they have similar problems and similar situations, and that would be another way to help mitigate climate change. And in that sense, there is something called the C40 cities, C for city. So the 40 biggest cities, by now the number has gone up. I think it's probably 90 cities in different parts of the world that are helping each other through their mayors in order to implement the Paris Agreement. And that brings me really to the key point here, which is designing a new climate regime based on plurilateral trade, right? The idea of a climate club. And I think to get there, we need to make sure that this idea of a climate club is both legally binding and enforceable. And the Paris Agreement is neither, which is why I have serious doubts about the efficiency of the Paris Agreement when it comes to climate change mitigation. So the argument here is that absent a global, legally binding and enforceable climate agreement, the idea of a climate club, in my view, would make a lot of sense. And of course, the idea is then to find all kinds of economic incentives so that countries may want to join this club. That raises the question, what is the rationale for a climate club? And I would argue very simply here that it's much easier to negotiate among a small group of large countries than it is among a large group of small countries. Okay, think, for example, of the European Union, right? When the European Union was created, there were only 6 countries back in the 1950s, and then over time, it's become today to be 27. Of course, at the time with 6, it was much easier to agree on whatever topic than it is today under 27 countries. Now, if you were to extrapolate that to the global system, it is definitely much easier to find agreement among the major emitters of the world, whatever the number may be, for example, the 12 major emitters or 15 major emitters, than it is 197 parties to the UNFCCC, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. So that's why I think it makes a lot of sense to create a climate club, in addition to what we have, not instead of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, but in parallel to what we have. Here, the question is, which would be the countries there? Right? I think Asia is a big part of the solution to climate change. If you think of the case of China, the number or the level of emissions of greenhouse gases has been going up exponentially, not incrementally or gradually, but exponentially since 1990. President Xi Jinping of China has clearly announced that China will continue to grow in terms of emissions until 2030, and then they will peak and come down to 2060, by which time they have promised that China will be net zero, okay? India is another example of a major part of the solution to climate change, where we have seen that over the years since 1990, the level of greenhouse gas emissions of India has gone up, and it will continue to do so. This is a prognosis. And so China and India are 2 key players in Asia for climate change mitigation. That therefore raises the question of what are the characteristics for the creation of a climate club. And it seems to me that there are 3 characteristics that appear evident. The first is that most emitters, big emitters of greenhouse gases, need to be members of the club. And this is important because otherwise, in my view, in my humble opinion, the purpose of the exercise will be futile. In other words, it doesn't matter whether the big emitters are developed or developing countries, but they need to be part of this club if we are serious about climate change mitigation in an effective manner. My second point is that membership benefits are a must, and they should outweigh obligations. In other words, what I have in mind here is that those countries that want to be members of this club have to have benefits. And these benefits have to be greater than their obligations. Otherwise, there will be no incentive for countries to want to join this club that I have in mind. And the third characteristic is that this club will need to be related to sanctions for non-compliance. And here I want to make a footnote and say that one would need to make sure that these sanctions would not violate international law or WTO legal rules. And here, for those of us who are following what is happening in the policy world, a case in point is the so-called CBAM, the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, which is an idea of the Europeans where they say we need to sanction people, right, in the relationship between climate change and international trade, more specifically WTO. I think it's a very well-intended idea of the Europeans. It remains to be seen whether it will be in compliance with WTO. My sense from what I've been reading lately is that pretty much everyone in the world is against this idea, so I can foresee a lot of cases in court. Now, this idea that I have of a bottom-up design of a climate club with incremental membership is not incredible, I think, because we have lessons from the trade regime and other regimes in international law where this has been the case. And I'll give you an example. The GATT, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, was created in 1947, and there were only 23 parties. And then gradually and incrementally, it became the World Trade Organization, today with 164 countries. So here's an example of a club, if you will, that was initially created with 23 parties and then gradually became 164. Another example is the European Union. As I said before, that in the 1950s was created with only 6 countries, and then gradually, over time, it became 28 countries, now 27 because of Brexit. NATO is another example of a club where gradually it went from 12 to 30 members. And a final example that I can think of is that of the United Nations, which was only 51 countries after World War II, and today is 193 countries. So we already have the idea, at least the platform of a club. Think of the Major Economies Forum on Energy and Climate, which was created by President Bush Jr. Towards the end of his second term, right before he left the White House. And he came up with this idea of 16 countries plus the European Union. So I'm going to think of the EU as a country here, 17 countries that we're getting together because is what I call the 80-80-60 principle. These 17 countries that are part of the Major Economies Forum are responsible for 80% of global emissions of greenhouse gases, 80% of the world's GDP, and 60% of the world's population. So although there are only 17 countries, there is a lot of legitimacy in this idea of a club. And then gradually and incrementally, other countries may want to join that are not yet in that club, right? An example of regionalism would be, excuse me, merging the international trading system with climate change. And here, what I would argue is that all you need is a few major emitters of greenhouse gases and only 3 mega regional trade agreements to really make a great contribution towards climate change mitigation and sustainable energy. And the 3 mega regional trade agreements that I have in mind are the so-called Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership in the Asia-Pacific region, Then the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, which is also in the Asia Pacific region, is the 10 countries of Southeast Asia, plus China, Japan, South Korea, Australia, and New Zealand. And then there is another one currently frozen, but could potentially be an excellent platform for this idea of a club, which is the US-EU Free Trade Agreement, the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership. So here, if you think of only these 3 trade agreements, that would be more than enough to solve more than half of the problem of climate change. And here's an example where I think the trading system can do very much in cooperation with the climate regime. Now, we know the links between trade and climate change. In fact, more than 25% of global carbon dioxide emissions are related to trade, where the United States, Japan, and Europe are the main importers of trade-related emissions, whereas China is by very far the main exporter of these emissions related to international trade. What we're seeing now in the specific case of international trade agreements is that the number of environmental provisions that appear in regional trade agreements has been increasing over time, and certainly since 2009. So that demonstrates, again, empirically, that all our countries are using international trade agreements for environmental protection. And that brings me to my 4th question, which is a textual analysis of trade agreements that have wording relevant to the environment. And here, what I would like to do is divide the various agreements that I have analyzed into 3 categories. One is US trade agreements with Korea, Colombia, Peru, the so-called Trans-Pacific Partnership, which never entered into force, but the agreement is there. So I analyzed that agreement. And then the United States, Mexico, Canada agreement, which is NAFTA 2.0. Second type of agreement is EU trade agreements with Japan, Singapore, Ukraine, Korea, the CETA, which is a comprehensive economic and trade agreement between Canada and the European Union, and then the Colombia-Peru agreement with the European Union. And then the 3rd category is what I call other trade agreements. For example, the US-EU trade agreement, as well as ASEAN agreements with China and India. Now, all these 14 agreements that I just mentioned have been chosen either because they include major emitters of greenhouse gases or because they have wording relevant to sustainable development. And what we see empirically is that the European Union leads in the number of provisions related to climate change in trade agreements. So, for example, provisions that deal with renewable energy, energy efficiency, climate change mitigation, and adaptation. But what we found, and I was actually very surprised to find this, is that the EU leads only in quantity of agreements, but not in the quality of these agreements. So here's what we did. We did a textual analysis taking into account 2 parameters. One is the content of these provisions that deal with climate change or environmental protection at large, and see whether the content, the substantive content, is weak, ambiguous, or solid. And then the second parameter is enforceability. And here the question is either the relevant provisions that we're talking about with environmental protection are enforceable or non-enforceable. And we came up with 5 possible configurations. The first is one where there is enforceability, but then weak substantive content. Second configuration, there is enforceability, but then the content is ambiguous. Third configuration is ambiguous substantive content, but then there is non-enforceability. Fourth, there is solid substantive content, but then non-enforceability. And the last configuration, which is the best, is one where there is solid substantive content and enforceability, but then we realized that the enforceability had a very restrictive scope. And so if you were to compare enforceability versus content, very much to our surprise, we realized that the best free trade agreements that deal with environmental protection are American free trade agreements and not European free trade agreements. And the reason, very simply, is that every single US free trade agreement offers enforceability, whereas not a single European free trade agreement offers enforceability. Some of them are very good in content, very solid, for example, the EU-Singapore, but then there is no enforceability of these provisions, right? That said, in my empirical analysis, I have come to see, excuse me, that the number of free trade agreements with enforceable environmental provisions has gone up over time. So that's good news, where we're making use of trade agreements in order to enforce environmental provisions. And so my proposal here would be the inclusion of adequate language. And by that I mean, and I take this from Article 12 of the EU-Singapore Free Trade Agreement, which says, and I quote, "The parties shall effectively implement the multilateral environmental agreements to which they are party." End of quote. So here's an example where both the Singaporeans and the Europeans are committed to the implementation of environmental agreements. But then if you go to the enforceability dimension of that agreement, then the problem is that the relevant provision needs to be covered by the dispute settlement chapter of that relevant agreement. So in a nutshell, we conclude that quantity does not correlate with quality, right? I started by saying that European FTAs are the ones that have the highest number of provisions that deal with environmental protection, but then the problem is the enforceability of those provisions. And therefore, we have seen empirically that it's actually American free trade agreements, the ones that seem to be best when it comes to environmental protection. So just in the interest of time, let me quickly conclude by saying a few notes here. So far, what we see is a limited input of trade agreements to climate change mitigation. I gave you the example of enforcement, where none of the free trade agreements of the European Union that I have analyzed offers enforceability for provisions relevant to the environment, whereas all the American FTAs do. However, when it comes to substantive content, where there is solid content, there is either no enforceability, which is the example of the EU-Singapore Free Trade Agreement, or restrictive scope blocks that potential of enforcement, which is the case of American free trade agreements. Second point I want to make here is that many trade agreements and the trade rules that we have today were designed in the 20th century. And at the time, we have very limited knowledge of the science of climate change. So the science of climate change was rather weak. So there was very limited mention of climate change in these agreements. Whereas now in the 21st century, and future trade agreements certainly should address the challenges of the 21st century, such as, for example, climate change. We see that recent free trade agreements have chapters that deal with sustainable development, but they're rather weak. So there is room for improvement. We know certainly much more about the science of climate change. It is much more robust than ever. So there is no excuse to use that science for policymakers in future trade agreements with legislators. And what we need definitely is a greater dialogue between trade and climate change, right? So I go back to my original point that absent a global legally binding and enforceable climate agreement, this idea of a climate club, in my view, makes a lot of sense. And just to conclude, way forward, some recommendations that I think are possible are, first, that we should minimize conflict between the trade and climate regimes. So here, what I have in mind is that we can think of an exception to the most favored nation principle, so the principle of non-discrimination in WTO law, if it is for a policy objective, such as climate change mitigation. Second recommendation is that we can revisit the concept of light products in the context of WTO law based on the amount of carbon that is used in making a product. This is, by the way, what Europeans are doing these days with the so-called carbon border adjustment mechanism, where if Turkey wants to export a product to the European Union, and Europeans think that, or know, or see that the level of carbon used for the production of that product is higher than what Europeans expect, then you will be taxed at the border. Hence, this idea of a carbon border adjustment mechanism. And of course, what a lot of people are saying is that this is a violation of international trade law, but Europeans say this is also for a policy objective, which is climate change mitigation. So it seems to me that there will be a lot of tension with this CBAM, as it is called, carbon border adjustment mechanism. A third recommendation is, as I said before, the creation of climate action via the formation of climate clubs, a plurilateral action to promote technology transfer among the members of that club. And it could be the G20 that we have already, it could be the G7, it could be cities in different parts of the world. That remains to be seen what the membership of that club is. Another recommendation is putting a price on carbon, which is what economists are saying. And here you could do it through a carbon tax or the emission trading system. And different countries in different parts of the world have already established emission trading systems. Another recommendation is the idea of subsidies, right? If you think of the G20, today it subsidizes fossil fuels with billions of dollars per year. And instead, why don't we use that public funding to subsidize renewable energy companies? And so this is really a very simple policy choice where public funding could be shifted from the fossil fuel industry to the renewable energy industry. And it would be, in my view, also a very simple way to help mitigate climate change. Also, we could target key sectors of the economy, such as fashion, which is responsible for 15% of greenhouse gas emissions. That means more than the United States, which is the second largest emitter in the world. Aviation is another key sector, which is responsible for about 5% of global emissions, or even shipping. The shipping industry is responsible for 3 to 5% of global emissions. So it's not an idea of just countries, which is what the Paris Agreement is talking about, an intergovernmental agreement, but I think we should be more ambitious than that and tackle also key sectors of the economy responsible for climate change. And certainly, unless we do something about this, with the rise of the middle class in populous countries such as China and India, emissions from aviation will only go up. And perhaps just to conclude, I would like to say that, as I was saying a few seconds ago, some sectors of the economy today emit more than major emitters. So you can think of the beef industry, which actually emits more emissions than Japan, or rice, the production of rice. If you look at it globally, it's actually responsible in terms of carbon dioxide emissions for more than a country like Japan, right? So I think there is room for improvement. It doesn't have to be just a country-to-country agreement, which is what the Paris Agreement is talking about, but we could go beyond that. And I think with that, let me leave it at that, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you may have.
Professor Leal-Arcas, thank you so much for this absolutely fascinating lecture on climate clubs and how investment law can be used as a tool to fight climate crisis. Thank you so much. Maybe I can take the privilege of being the moderator of this lecture and ask you a question. You have mentioned in the beginning of your lecture that to create such a system, there must be some membership benefits more than the obligations. So what kind of benefits do you have in your mind?
Yes, excellent. Thank you so much for the question. What I have in mind is something similar to regionalism in the context of international trade. So think of the European Union, think of ASEAN, think of other regional integration blocks, right? Why would I want to be a member of a club unless there are benefits for me in that club, right? So here I'm thinking of economic incentives, right? If you think of the European Union, you have, in the context of international trade, you already have multilateralism, and that is the WTO, right? And the idea of the WTO is the principle of non-discrimination. You must treat everyone equally. However, the WTO treaty enables you to create regionalism. However, to get there, you need to give preferential treatment on substantially all the trade. That's what the treaty says. And so that means that the members of that bloc, in this case, the European Union, are allowed to give each other preferential treatment so long as they do so on substantially all the trade, not just trade in cars, but it has to be trade in 90% of the trade that France is doing with Germany, Germany with Greece, and so on. Otherwise, why would I want to be a member of a club if I'm not going to get something more than what I already have, right? So that's the idea of a club in international trade. My idea of a club in climate change is very similar. We would need to find benefits to be a member of the club so that countries want to join, but more importantly, once they're members, they don't want to leave the club. And that certainly is not the case of the European Union, as we have learned with the case of Brexit. So the UK joined the European Union in 1973 because obviously it realized there is something to be gained if I, United Kingdom, become a member of the European Union. And then years later, they realized that this is not really what they wanted. And therefore, as a sovereign nation, they have the right to withdraw from that agreement. And so the United Kingdom democratically decided to leave the European Union. In the idea of a climate club, that's exactly what I have in mind. We need to think about incentives for countries to want to join. But as I said, that's not enough. Then you need to make sure that nobody wants to leave. And here, we know clearly the science of climate change. We know the economics of climate change. We know the law of climate change. But what we don't know is how countries may want to cooperate in order to have this club. And whoever has the answer to that question, in my view, will get the Nobel Prize.
Thank you, Professor, for your answer. I have another question, but I will wait after having other participants' questions. If there is time, I would like to ask another. Then Ece can help us with having the questions.
Sure, Professor Çıkar. With this opportunity, I would like to thank Professor Leal-Arcas'ı for this amazing and influencing presentation, and welcome again our participants. We have several questions, also we can receive new questions as well. First of all, I would like to give the floor to Mr. Nathan Brown.
Thank you very much, Professor. I hope I'm clear. I'm loud enough.
I hear you very well.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, and thank you very much. Okay, this topic really concerns humanity, and speaking as a human being from the African continent, the city of Nairobi, beautiful city of Nairobi, Kenya. I already know that in terms of regionalism, in Africa, we have first the African Union, the equivalent of the European Union, and we have 9 regional economic blocs already established by treaties. In this regard, you have memberships, which you mentioned, is a requisite consideration. So if you look at the Intergovernmental Authority on Development as one bloc, which is a regional bloc, which puts Nairobi together with Addis Ababa, Kampala, Eritrea, Sudan, and all that, you have 12 member countries who have previously done their cooperation framework arrangements in several fields, agriculture, terrorism, military cooperation, and trade now that what then would it take not to have this club executed altogether, working in various areas? When you have a crisis in Somalia, countries come together and they put together a military base and they work on this. You have a problem in Ethiopia now where there's a bit of infighting. The African Union, through that regional economic bloc, already works. So we are 75%, 80% on club establishment because we already have that in place. So I hope you can take us through what then it would require to do the next 20% to put this together, because we already have the architecture, personnel, people understand climate change very well. And so we need to just move with speed and do that, whether it's now within the East African community, the economic community for West African states, the Northern Africa, SADC, the Southern African Development Cooperation, or COMESA, the Common Market for Eastern and South Africa. So that's the one bit I would like you to address, Professor. The second is on real trade and economic benefits. You tie that down with the environmental protection. Since those two treaties came into force, the 1992, particularly the one on the Convention on Biological Diversity, that has very good provisions that benefit largely developing countries, including access to genetic resources, transfer of technology, which again is also inbuilt in the Law of the Sea Convention, which is also a 1982 convention 10 years before. Countries trade in order to put food on the table for their people. And to a large extent, I do speak for the African continent. I understand many continents, but this is my continent. It takes very little consideration to discuss carbon emission, things to do with the climate change, climate action, because they would like to put together a package that feeds the people who are hungry, up in many parts of Africa, whether it's Senegal, Sudan, and so on. So why would anybody consider an incentive if already they don't have access to that food which they need? And they really don't have to have an incentive in order to walk out or to remain. And the third bit, allow me to just build a quick limb onto what I've just said. Trade between countries, especially from continent to continent, take a country in Africa, like Kenya, and then take another one in Asia. Let's talk about Pakistan, for example. In about 2 weeks, there'll be a delegation going to Pakistan to discuss trade. Okay, this is through the Kenya National Chamber of Commerce and Industry. So they want to import goods. This is heavy equipment for infrastructure development, machinery for agricultural production, and so on. What would it take to have a provision that stipulates that we will not bring in your equipment unless we have looked at that consideration you talk about, how they were produced in the factories? So it would mean ministers will have to give a report, environmental friendly equipment, if it is going to be used in agriculture production in many parts of Africa. So there is the convenience to go for a quick gain, then talk about emission later and the destruction that it will cause. Because people are hungry, they want to get the food. Then what happens, whether the doctors will look after them when they're sick, is a totally different thing, because they want to be alive before they become sick. Otherwise, I want to thank you. I hope it's a mouthful that you can handle. And of course, we can continue discussing this. Thank you very much for the discussion.
Thank you so much, Nathan, for a very, very rich 2 questions full of information. So let me try and answer the best way I can. And I want to start by thanking you really very much for bringing so much information to the table here. The first was regionalism in Africa, right? And you started with the big picture, which is the African Union. We also have now a free trade agreement, pan-African, so that's something important to take into account. And then regionalizing Africa, as you rightly said. So we have all kinds of regional economic blocks, the East African Community, ECOWAS, COMESA, SADC, and so on and so forth. So I think all of that is fantastic, right? And you were asking, well, how can we make this work, right? Well, my hint here would be implementation is important, the implementation of all these agreements in Africa through institutions, having strong institutions and making sure that these great ideas that you have in Africa at the moment, not just the African Union for the whole continent, but also subcontinental, if you will, the other 9 regional economic blocks that you mentioned. So what comes to my mind is to have important strong institutions and implementation and making sure that this is effective for the benefit of the people of Africa. On your second question, I thought it was fascinating connecting trade and the economic benefits that you were talking about. And you said, and rightly so, that food comes first. Then why should we focus so much on climate mitigation if the most important thing is having food on the table? There, I would say, if you look at the situation in sub-Saharan Africa, it is unfortunate that because of the science of climate change, the countries, the major victims of the consequences of climate change are those countries near the equator. So those countries in sub-Saharan Africa, right? And these are the ones that have done the least in terms of contribution to climate change. So I find it really ironic that sub-Saharan Africa has contributed the least to climate change, and yet it is the major victim of the consequences of climate change. Let me explain what I mean by that. I'm a farmer in sub-Saharan Africa. Because of the consequences of climate change, I can no longer work my land, my farm. So what do? I emigrate. And where do I go? To Europe. And this is another catastrophe that we're seeing, where sub-Saharan Africans cross the Sahara Desert, go to Northern Africa, I'm talking about here, Libya and Tunisia, get on a boat, and then we know the rest. I would argue a genocide before the noses of Europeans, and Europeans are doing nothing about it. But what is the reason? I would argue climate change. So when you say food comes first, I agree with you. But if you go further back, why is it that the farmer in Africa can no longer work in his farm? I argue because of the West, because of the emissions of greenhouse gases, right? The North Pole, and again, this is something shocking and ironic, that the science of climate change, because of the shape of the Earth, when the ice melts in the North Pole, in Greenland, for example, it goes closer to the equator. And the consequences come in that part of the world, which, as I said before, these are the countries that are contributing the least. I'm not saying they're not contributing. If you think of Burundi, Rwanda, these countries also contribute to climate change, but really minimally, especially if you compare with the West. And here I'm talking about the United States and Europe. And so now, to answer your question, Sub-Saharan Africa is what I meant. Agriculture is what is suffering there. And therefore, I think it is absolutely crucial for Africa more specifically Sub-Saharan Africa, Black Africa, to take climate change into account seriously. Now, it's a question here of responsibility. And it's very clear to me, based on empirical evidence, that those that are responsible are the West. With the Industrial Revolution, the first Industrial Revolution started in the UK. From there, it went to continental Europe and the United States. And so since more than 100 years, we are seeing the accumulation of emissions of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. But again, as I said, ironically, the major victims are not the perpetrators, but Sub-Saharan Africa.
Thank you, Professor. And our next question is from Gürkan Çağan. He asked me to read this question, so I'm reading it. Hello, Mr. Leal-Arcas. I'm graduate student Gürkan Çağan. It's a great honor and a great chance to listen to you in this program. And I would like to thank Ms. Aslan Erbaş for this magnificent program. I'm writing my thesis on sustainability in international investment law. In line with the principles of sustainable development, we see that some provisions in bilateral investment treaties, such as MFN clauses, national treatments, or expropriation, have changed, especially general exceptions, provisions that reserve the right of the host state to regulate human, animal, and plant life. So I wonder, can the regulations taken regarding the sustainable environment be accepted as a principle in international investment law, and especially in bilateral investment treaties? I mean, can we see the regulations for climate change as principle of international investment law?
Right. Well, very rich question as well. Thank you very much for that question, linking sustainability to international investment law. I think investment is absolutely crucial if we're serious about climate change mitigation. And one thing that we have seen was promised as a result of the COP21 that gave birth to the Paris Agreement in 2015 was that from 2020, the so-called rich world was supposed to give $100 billion a year to help mitigate climate change. But that has not happened, right? And you could argue something happened in between called COVID. Of course, in 2015, no one knew that COVID was going to come at the end of 2019. But the fact of the matter is that what was promised by the developed world, namely to give $100 billion a year to help the developing world in climate change mitigation and adaptation, back to Nathan's point, has not happened. The latest that we have seen is that the rich world has promised that that money will come perhaps in 2023 or in 2025, right? So I think it's important to recognize that investment is absolutely crucial, especially investment in technology. It seems to me that a large part of the solution to the problem that we're discussing here is with technology. If, for example, suddenly all the roads in the world were covered with electric vehicles as opposed to combustion energy vehicles, about 20% of global emissions would disappear. And how can we get there? Through technology. And how can we get to technology? Through investment. So I think investment plays a major role in sustainability, and we will see that coming in years to come.
And our next question is from Ece Saygılar. The question is, should the unity in climate clubs consist of regionality or capacity?
Sorry, can you repeat the question again?
Should the unity in climate clubs consist of regionality or capacity?
Regionality?
Regionality.
So being a regionality or capacity?
Yes.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I don't think I understand the question.
So maybe we can ask for clarification from Ms. Saygılar and continue with the next question at this time. Next question is from Ayşenur Aktaş. You mentioned the necessity of incentives for operability. how can there be assurances other than being in a regional cooperation and dispute settlement, considering that this is difficult to achieve in multilateral agreements, to ensure the enforceability of existence of these incentives within climate clubs?
Yeah, indeed, this is a big question, a very important one, certainly from a practical point of view. Enforceability is a big problem in environmental law, not just in climate change, right? And we have seen that, and I said that in my presentation, that the way I see international environmental agreements is that they have no teeth, right? So that if I am in violation of the agreement, you cannot take me to court. And that is in itself a problem, which is why I have proposed that perhaps a more effective way to mitigate climate change is if we have provisions in trade agreements, which are enforceable, that deal with climate change, right? That would be, I think, a very effective way to do so. So I recognize that enforceability is a problem, indeed. And that is why I have issues with the Paris Agreement. It's well-intentioned, I understand all of that, but the enforcement mechanism is the problem. If you think of the international trading system, the WTO is a case in point where if you're in violation of the agreement, then a country will take you to court, right? And then there is a panel of 3 members. And in the good old days, not anymore, because President Trump decided to put an end to the appellate body. But in case you disagree with the decision of the panel, then you could appeal before the appellate body. And so this is the idea that I have in mind, that given that enforceability, as the question is asking here, is a big issue, I propose making use of the international trading system for the enforcement of environmental duties, obligations here.
Thanks to Ms. Aktaş for this question. And the next question is from Ayça Sezer. Before my question, I want to thank Mr. Leal-Arcas for this very interesting speech. My question is, even the climate clubs would be an effective way to environmental protection. What environmental and economic consequences could climate clubs create?
Well, my idea of a climate club is putting together countries that are serious about going faster and further with climate change mitigation. I'm not saying that we should get rid of the existing architecture that we have, which is the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, 197 parties. But the problem I have with that, it's very slow. And also you need unanimity or consensus. And this is very difficult among 197 parties. So it's much easier if we have a smaller group of countries or parties, right, to agree on something. And so from that point of view, it seems to me that the idea of a climate club in parallel to what we have makes a lot of sense for those countries that are willing to go faster and further. Now, if you do that and you want to avoid the idea of free riding, which I recognize is another big problem, then we need to find economic incentives so that countries would be willing to join and benefit from that club membership. So for example, think of technology transfer. Imagine I want to be a member of the club, but I don't have the necessary climate technology to mitigate climate change. By being a member of this club, I could benefit from that, and it would be a way for me to help in my jurisdiction mitigate climate change. And this is the sort of architecture that I have in mind, so that you benefit not only economically, but also environmentally. In the good old days, you had to choose, or people thought it was a trade-off between economic growth and environmental protection. But it doesn't have to be that way. And that's exactly what I'm proposing here. I think it's perfectly possible to continue to grow economically, cleanly. And how do you get there? Through technology. So I'm very confident that the international community will find a way to find a solution to climate change through investment, as the previous colleague was asking in the previous question, and investing more specifically in technology. There's a lot of things we can do, right? So I'm very optimistic about the future. I'm more importantly about young people, because youth are, in my view, a big part of the solution to climate change. Young people, more than anyone, believe in the importance of sustainability. Young people, I mean, the ones here present, if you were to ask your grandmother what she thinks about climate change, again, with all my respects to your grandmother, I'm not saying here that I don't like your grandmother, but I am convinced that you know more about climate change than your grandmother. And so only for that am I convinced that youth is a big part of the solution to climate change. And in fact, I was listening last week to the Egyptian Minister of Foreign Affairs, who, as you know, Egypt will be will host the next COP. COP27 will take place in Egypt, and COP28 will take place in Abu Dhabi, in the United Arab Emirates. And so what the Egyptian Minister of Foreign Affairs was saying, who is responsible for the next COP, the Conference of the Parties, is that he wants to make sure that young people are engaged. So he wants to engage with young people, with youth, because he realizes, and he's absolutely right, that young people are part of the solution. Young people understand the importance of sustainability. So it's also a question of generation, right? It's an intergenerational issue, if you will. Again, go back to your grandmother, 2 generations up, and ask her what she thinks about climate change. And probably, I would think, she doesn't know as much as you do. And so I'm actually very hopeful. I'm very optimistic. When I listen to politicians, it's rather depressing to see that they have negative views about where the world is going in terms of climate change. Of course, I recognize, looking at the numbers, that we're not doing well, but that's not the point. The point is, can we find a solution to the problem? And I argue, yes. And a large part of the solution is in technology, through investment and engagement with young people.
Thanks, Ms. Cesar, for the question. And next 2 questions is from Mr. Ahmed. My question is, can we say border carbon adjustment will solve the problem of synergy climate change and trade agreements? Also, can we say climate agreements are not successful because they are not enforceably binding?
Well, to question number 2, I would say yes. I think that's largely the problem here. Because if I'm not legally bound to do something, I'm only promising something, and then I misbehave, what can you do against me other than name and shame, right? Which is another way to get there. So I would argue, again, my humble opinion is absolutely, I think part of the problem lies with the legal design of climate change agreements, in that they're not enforceable. As to the first question, the carbon border adjustment mechanism, this is a technical question. It remains to be seen, but for those of you who are not so familiar, I'll give you a very simple example that I gave before. Imagine Turkey wants to export a product made in Turkey. Once it reaches the border, and let's assume for the sake of the argument that the level of carbon in the production of that good is higher than what Europeans claim should be the level, then Turkey will be taxed at the border, hence the so-called carbon border adjustment mechanism, in order to compensate for misbehaving, if you will, right? For using more carbon than you should have. Now, that raises a very interesting question from an international trade point of view. Is the European in violation of free trade? And you could argue prima facie, yes, because the whole purpose of the exercise is to liberalize trade. That's what the WTO is all about. But then there is an agreement, there's an article in the GATT, Article 20, which is about the exceptions, Article 20G, more specifically, letter G, which is what we're talking about here. If it is done for a policy objective, specifically climate change mitigation, then it's perfectly fine to create a technical barrier to trade if it is for the greater good here. And of course, that raises the question, who is right, Turkey or the European Union? And it seems to me, but I don't know, that in years to come, we will see a lot of cases in court precisely over CBAM. So the Europeans unilaterally, I think, mean well. The question is whether it will be WTO compatible, whether this is a violation of the principle of non-discrimination, whether it fits and falls roundly within GATT Article 20, letter G, which is If it is for a policy objective, where then there is an exception to the principle of non-discrimination. And all of that remains to be seen. So really, it's a fascinating time to study all of this, highly complex. It's really at the crossroads between international trade and climate change. And we'll see what will happen.
And Mr. Ahmed messaged a follow-up, I guess, and states that, however, this article does not mention anything about climate change. Generally, just doctrines are discussing XX is applicable to climate change. Can we use climate change waiver or peace clause for CBAM?
Right, excellent question. Absolutely. And the reason climate change was not mentioned in the GATS, or is not mentioned in the GATT, is that in 1947, no one knew that climate change exists. Of course it did exist. We just didn't know. Hence the importance of science. It was only years later that empirically scientists started to realize that something was happening. And as I said in my presentation, the first legal instrument that deals with climate change came only in 1992. But that doesn't mean that we started with the problem of climate change in 1992. We started much before. I mean, climate change being anthropogenic is my point here, not climate change as a natural phenomenon, right? And so the whole thing started with the Industrial Revolution. The GATT that we're talking about here, that the question raised here, is from 1947. So the Regional Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, Article 20, and the questionnaire is absolutely right. The person asking the question does not mention climate change. But the reason is very simple. The legislator didn't know that climate change existed, but it did exist. It's only years later that now scientists are demonstrating that climate change is anthropogenic. So my simple proposition here is that moving forward, future agreements, certainly trade agreements, should incorporate climate change, because now we have the science of climate change, which is much more robust than ever, and therefore there is no reason not to include climate change. And to give you a final example here, President Macron of France, when trying to move forward with this EU-US free trade agreement, said to the Americans, of course this is under Trump administration, if you want to have business with us, first, the environment. In other words, you need to implement the Paris Agreement if you want to do business with Europeans. And the only way to have a free trade agreement with the European Union is if you are in compliance with or implementing the Paris Agreement.
The final question for now, please, is from Yitazareran. Firstly, I would like to thank Professor Rafael Leal-Arcas'ı for his amazing lecture, and I would like to thank Address University Climate Change and Law Laboratory for providing us this platform. We are more than grateful. My question is, by the consideration of the location of Turkey between Europe and Asia, how do you evaluate Turkey's existence in the climate change clubs? Does it take place only as a part of these intergovernmental organizations, or does Turkey obey the obligations? How do you consider of Turkey's precautions about climate change?
Yeah, excellent question. I mean, the location of Turkey geographically is excellent. As the person asking the question rightly said, it's between Europe and Asia, right? And I think that makes Turkey a very attractive country to be part of any club, right? It tried since the late 1950s to join another club, the European Union, for various reasons that we know that never happened. But it doesn't matter, because Turkey now is a regional power in its own region, right, in the Middle East, right? So I think Turkey is an excellent candidate for what I have in mind. Let's think of the G20 as a possible platform for a club. As far as I know, Turkey is a member of the G20. It's a large economy. It will continue to grow economically. And therefore, I think its role in my idea of a climate club could be meaningful, right? By the way, in terms of membership of this climate club, I'm very open. All I say here is that it's absolutely important that the major emitters be members of the club. And that was not the case of the Kyoto Protocol which made a clear distinction between Annex I countries, so developed countries, and then the rest of the world. If we follow that approach, I don't think we're able to solve meaningfully the problem of climate change, because there are today in the top 10 emitters, 5 of them are developing countries. So if you follow the reasoning of the Kyoto Protocol, they would be out, right? And I'm all about inclusion. So I think my idea of a climate club where the major emitters of greenhouse gases are present, whether these are developed or developing countries, is much more effective. And in fact, my criticism with the Kyoto Protocol is that it's only making legally binding those developed countries, right? These are the only countries that are legally bound to reduce the emissions of greenhouse gases. But if the Chinas of the world are not on board, we cannot solve the problem. Equally, I'm not asking China to perform in the same manner as the West, because historically the West is much more responsible than the rest of the world. Okay, so I want to make this clear that in terms of membership of a club, I don't think the idea of the Kyoto Protocol is enough. The membership is too narrow. We need to expand to major emitters. It doesn't matter whether these emitters are developed or developing countries. Now, that said, that raises another question of climate justice, fairness. And of course, we will need to find a way to make sure that developing countries perform, but not, the demand is not as high as that of developed countries.
Thank you to Professor Leal-Arcas'ı and our audience. I would like to give the floor to Professor Açıkel.
Thank you so much. Am I allowed to ask my question now, Professor Arcas?
Of course.
Okay, thank you. It is my understanding from your presentation that the investment agreements should be better in quality in terms of climate change provisions, and also they should be enforceable. My question regards the existing agreements, which have been already concluded at the end of the 20th century or at the beginning of 21st century. In most of these agreements, the reference is made to best environmental standards, and nothing more than this is concluded in those agreements. And as you have mentioned, the science has proved that we need to do more in the agreements because of this climate change. So we make other bilateral agreements and also international agreements. But in those already existing agreements between the states and an investor company, for example, they have stabilization clauses, like this actually relates to the one of the questions already asked. But in those stabilization clauses, the economic equilibrium is protected. So if law changes, and if it affects the already existed economic conditions, then they will not be effective for the side of the investor. So how do you see this at the moment from an investment law perspective? So there are new international agreements, but can they be enforced against the already existing investment agreements between the states and the companies, particularly?
Right. So we see that's, for example, in the case of the Energy Charter Treaty, which is from 1994, but then there's a large investment component in that treaty. And the idea that is happening now is the modernization of that treaty. And you need an upgrade. Why? Because now we know things that we didn't know before, right? The science of climate change is much more important. All countries are into sustainable development, sustainability. So it's a way of upgrading things based on needs. So that's absolutely doable. And as I said, it is happening as we speak in the case of the Energy Charter Treaty that deals, among other things, with investment.
Okay, thank you, Professor. And I think Mr. Brownie has a final comment. Maybe we can have his comment too.
Maybe it's a two-tier question I would pose. On CBAM and pre-inspection of goods, I see a lot of meetings going on around the globe, and particularly in this part of the world, you have business-to-business meetings. I mentioned the one on Pakistan, which is I'm privileged that I'll be part of the team that will be, because I belong to the Kenya National Chamber of Commerce and Industry. So we'll be going to check on how to collaborate with the professionals, importers, exporters, and so on and so forth. And then that's inbuilt. You know, it's very difficult to have that adjustment at the border or the point of entry when the goods are coming in through the Indian Ocean, for example. They come through the port of Mombasa, and the people who have already imported the goods have done pre-inspection, have been given, issued with the certificates of origin, and the sale agreements have been concluded, and the lawyers have done their work and have been paid, and they've pocketed the money, they've gone. Now, I just want to see how practical it is to do the adjustment upon the realization that this production of those goods or specific goods did not meet the requirements with respect to carbon, levels as required within the international protocols and regime. The second bit of that, China, as we speak, not too far away from here, actually just up the road, Nairobi is constructing one of the finest expressway. Just go to the airport in a matter of 3 minutes and you're done. And that's being done by China. China has brought in heavy equipment, plant and machinery that is unrivaled and unmatched. And this, as you can see, China is doing a lot of trade with Africa. And the local contractors don't have much access to these. So the Chinese government will tell you, we'll go and do this through the Exim Bank, and we'll give you this facility, and the loan will be repaid in, say, 30 years or so. But they have the wherewithal in terms of technology, in terms of equipment, the engineers that work night and day. I don't live very far from there, and I can tell you their kind of pollution in terms of noise and so on is unbearable, but perhaps worth it in the long term. How would you then question the government that has fed you, quote unquote, with this new technology, impressive capacity, human resource deployment, unmatched, although you have engineers that are equally qualified, perhaps even better. So he who, how does it go with a pipe? Pays, So it's very difficult, and I would like to see how to strike that balance where you'd say, okay, your equipment has not met this requirement, and so they'll say, okay, stay with your impoverishment, and we'll stay with our poorly produced equipment, and who gains and who loses. So that balance is a little difficult to strike, because then you will go down a little bit and say, okay, let's use it. We can deal with the consequences later. So if you find a moment, please do so. And I'll be happy to continue this discussion from here on. And thank you very much. I rest my case. Thank you.
I'm the one to thank you. Thank you very much. I should say that unfortunately, because of the weak connection that I have here, I lost much of your first question that I know is about CBAM, but I was not able to hear what you were saying, so I apologize for that. On the second question about China, you're absolutely right. it's been quite a few years now that there's this love affair, if I may use that term, between China and Africa. Africa has benefited immensely. China has helped very much in the construction of roads, ports, airports, hospitals, bridges. So this is wonderful news for Africa, which could have gone elsewhere, as most countries do, for example, the World Bank. But then, as we know, the World Bank comes with conditionality. China doesn't ask for conditionality. And therefore, that is the reason why African countries, governments have chosen to work with China as opposed to the World Bank. And you raised very good points about the good technology that comes from the Chinese, human capital, that they work very much. My understanding from the times I've been in Africa teaching is that Africans were complaining that when China is investing in Africa for a project, they actually bring their workers with them from China. And therefore that doesn't help the local community, right? So that if you're someone living in Africa, you don't benefit from the building of that port, airport, bridge, whatever that is, right? But I think that's a matter of choice, right? You can choose between going to the World Bank, but then you have conditionality in terms of good governance, otherwise we don't give you loans, or going with the Chinese. What matters here is to grow for the benefit of everyone. I know we're out of time, so I just want to conclude by saying that I'm very optimistic about the future. I am convinced that through technology and the advancement of science, we can actually get there, and the input of youth, as I was saying before, the engagement of young people for a sustainable future for everyone.
Unexpectedly, I'm taking the floor back because we received one more question, and I want to refer to Professor Arcas if he lets me.
Yes.
And it is that the question is bearing in mind that Kyoto does have a binding provision on developed countries, as you said. However, the Kyoto Protocol does not link between climate and trade systems. Therefore, if the country is member of the WTO and Kyoto Protocol, do they need to follow both agreements, which should be difficult because climate agreements include some trade restrictive measures because of its goal? What is the solution for this?
Yeah, again, another very good, very technical question. Indeed, the Kyoto Protocol is only legally binding on developed countries. And I argue, as a result, the Kyoto Protocol was doomed to fail from the very beginning. Because the problem of climate change is so big that only developed countries is not enough to solve the problem, which is why I'm proposing an alternative architecture for climate change that I call climate clubs, where not only the major developed countries, but also major developing countries need to be part if we're serious about climate change mitigation, right? This is what I think is very important. And the issue of being binding is a big issue, as I see it. But on the other hand, if you were to make it legally binding, then I guess countries will not want to join, which is why the Paris Agreement is not legally binding, right? Anyway, for me, I just want to say that I'm very hopeful. I am convinced that we have the technology. I believe in brain power, in humans, in human capital. And I have no doubt that in the future, if we work collectively, if we cooperate and we help each other, we can actually get there, and we will all have a much better future where we will all be richer and healthier. So it's about wealth and health.
Yes, thank you very much for your comprehensive and impressive answers, Professor Arcas. And I would like to thank everyone in the audience for their insightful questions. And unfortunately, we have come to the end of time allocated to us for this event. And I hope everyone enjoyed today's lecture. Personally, I have learned a lot. I thank you again. And we wish you stick with us on our next seminar. Please send us an email to CCLLAB@khas@edu.tr if you wish to be included in our mailing list for our future events. And Professor Leal-Arcas, before we finish, it's over to you for your closing words.
Over to me.
Yes.
Well, I have to say thank you very much. I'm actually very surprised that so many people showed up. I'm very hopeful that we can actually collaborate, as I was saying before, as an institution, my university with your university, and I look forward to future collaboration between the two of us.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you so much. And for now, goodbye to everyone. Looking forward to seeing you again. Bye-bye.